All right, so now we're moving into our book club segment for the week. This is going to be a very short and sweet segment, both because Alaric still isn't feeling very well and is a little tired. Um, and also, so we're halfway through the book right now, which is Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. So spoilers for the first half, but next week we're gonna try to power through to the end of the book, and then we'll probably have a much longer segment next week where we'll be talking about the book in full,
For
and
sure.
then yeah,
So yeah. The other, you know, I have obviously I do a lot of reading. So when we started doing this book club, we had planned to just chunk it up into quarters of a book per week. That didn't go so well in that I had a hard time holding myself back and ended up reading the entire thing pretty much in the first week. So um, yeah, I have taken. I mean, when I read books to begin with, I'm somebody who kind of takes overall concepts, sort of, and I can read through something and completely forget everything specific that happened in the book. If somebody brings up, oh, do you remember this or that? Like, be like, yeah, I remember that. But if somebody told me to like even just lay out the events in order, I'd have a hard time. But
it's funny. We
I,
talk a lot on this show about how much we're the same, being brothers and all, but this is a case where I'm the like exact polar opposite. I'm probably the world's slowest reader, but I remember stories like
yeah.
almost page by page. So
So at least I guess we bring different things to the table, at least. So there's that.
for sure. And I mean, next week we will be talking about kind of the themes of the book as a whole. So that will be
Right.
your time to shine. The other thing is, we would normally, 4 episodes would be 1 month, and that's how we'd break up the books. But just because of all the scheduling issues and the trials of starting a new podcast and trying to figure that all out, it actually has been much longer than a month since we started reading this book. So yeah, so after next week, we will be kicking off a new book club and a new book club pick, and we are going to try to actually do that one week by week, over 4 shows. So, yeah, we'll do better next time.
Yeah, it should be a better experience. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the first half of this one.
For sure.
So,
I mean, would you have anything to start out? Just because I hear the tamale cart coming in, it's going to get louder and louder, so I'm going to turn off my mic
oh
if you
dear.
don't
I
mind.
mean, not particular. I was hoping you could start it off just because you are sort of fresh um, out of the trenches with it. Um,
Yeah, that's what we had talked about, but I was not anticipating the tamale cart. Oh, it sounds like it's going away, actually.
nice.
Okay, cool. Um, so the thing freshest in my mind, mostly because it's the thing that happened basically at the halfway point where I left off, is the snowstorm. So I'm assuming you can at least remember that part. It wasn't
Yeah,
fairly
no.
big.
I remember. I remember the snowstorm. I get it was a pretty fairly big plot point. So, yeah, obviously they're making preparations to go blow up a bridge. Um, it's a plan that I mean, there are a whole bunch of aspects to it, but one of the aspects is it has to go off at a very specific time because the enemy obviously has their plans for how they're going to be moving around their troops and tanks and all that. Um, and so there's going to be a battle happening, and the Republicans need to have the bridge blown up and not have the fascists be able to switch things around, make redirect their troops. They need to just find the bridge blown up. There's a battle happening. They need to be like, oh crap. So the fact that there's a bunch of snow coming down, and as I recall, is quite. It looked quite relentless. It looked like a full-blown snowstorm in which, when you kind of have those snowstorms, it can kind of be a toss-up. Like it could end in a couple hours, or it could go for a week. Um, so obviously that's something where tensions are pretty high because if the snow just keeps on falling, they don't really, they don't really have another option but to just call off the mission.
Yeah, for sure. So it is. I mean, it is something I kind of love about Hemingway, where he has such a good attention for detail that like it's such a little random thing, like a snowstorm happens that, like you said, does derail the whole plot.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, glad you brought up the thing of, they have to do this on a very exact schedule, which that also in itself is kind of a point of tension between Robert Jordan, our main character, and everyone else involved. Is that Robert Jordan is the only one who really know or understands why it has to be at a certain time. I mean, he definitely does his best to convey that to everyone around him. I guess Sordo kind of isn't thrilled about it, but does seem to get it. But
yeah, and I mean, you kind of have, so obviously Robert Jordan is kind of an outsider in this whole group, and he's coming in with this plan. Like, he's already, not exactly, he's coming in and bringing orders from outside. Like, this band of people living up in the mountains, like, they are on the Republican side. But I kind of have got the sense throughout the story that there's a little bit, there's just kind of almost like a degree of separation between them and the Republicans. So
yeah, I mean, it's like, it's not like two nations going to war. It was like a revolution, and so I don't actually know as much as I should, especially before reading this book, about the Spanish Civil War, other than what Del Toro taught me. But yeah, like just my understanding of revolutions in general. So there is some sort of core, like military, like what Robert Jordan would belong to, but also guerrilla groups are going to rise up like all over the country, which is exactly what happened with Pablo. Like Pablo wasn't part of any actual Republican government or whatever. He just said like, hey, we're kicking the fascists out of this town. And then people kind of coalesced around him. Yeah. So it's like they're on the same side because they're fighting against the same enemy, but then you have the actual organized group who theoretically is also the ones who would be taking power after the war ends if they win, but then these other guerrilla groups that are like fighting for the same cause as them, but technically not really under their authority. Yeah, so I think that's fascinating, and I don't even know if the author intended this, but it's almost like a microcosm of the like the conflict of the ideals of the war itself, like whether or not the sides actually live up to these standards. Like one side is the fascists and one side is the Republicans or the communists even, and Robert Jordan is kind of representing a fascist power, even if he's presenting like a smart, practical, like the way to win the war, to the people who were in that camp all along. He's basically someone coming in and saying like, hey, the authority says you have to do this, and we're not going to question or argue with the authority.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely kind of have a juxtaposition between kind of two styles of doing things, and that you have armies are generally for good reason. They're very rigid, they're structured, they're organized, they work on specific time schedules. And then you have this band of some people, a member of the band is just like a straight up gypsy, and they're all kind of like that. They're just a bunch of people living up in a cave in a mountain. They don't really work with any. They sort of have a hierarchy within, their couple. I guess Pablo is kind of their leader, and then Pilar has kind of, taken over that role a little bit, with Pablo sort of slipping. But really, you don't have the hierarchy. You don't have that sort of sense of structure and schedule. So you kind of have. You have people who don't normally have to work that way, having somebody come in and kind of put that on them. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely obviously some tension there, even though they're on the same side, just because of the two different styles of doing things.
For sure, so, and yeah. It goes back to what we talked about before with like Pablo originally was like a powerful force in the movement, and then he kind of got comfortable and complacent, and he's almost like he's enjoying his, or at least feeling comfortable and relaxing in his role in the war, which you don't usually think of as what would happen in a war. But for him, he's just like, yeah, I've got my cave and I've got my people, and I get drunk on wine every night, and Pilar makes me food. And you would think if you were in a war, it's like the most horrible situation you could be in, and you would do anything to win the war and just have it over and like not really think about anything else. But
Mm-hmm.
um, it's funny. So I actually saw a review. It was a review of another of his books, A Farewell to Arms, about the First World War. And this was actually a really negative 1 star review, but I actually thought I really liked the book and I actually thought it captured the book very well. And he was basically like, here, you can skip reading the book. The moral is that war is boring. And it's definitely something Hemingway is good at capturing. And I mean, I know you read and enjoyed Catch 22 by Joseph Heller as well. That's something he is definitely really good at capturing too, which is war is kind of boring and mundane and banal, like until it's not.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean they joke about this in the army itself. There's the whole hurry up and wait thing, which is like most of a soldier's duty is standing still and waiting for the time to act.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, my point with all that is it's like they're in a war, they're in supposedly the most dire of human situations, and there's so many other considerations in the way, like Pablo's pride, and even that goes to Pilar and the others. Like at first they're on Jordan's side, but then he's saying like, no, we have to, like the plan is to do it this certain way. You would think they would be like, okay, whatever wins the war, but they're like, no, like we don't want to be told what to do. Like this is our field of battle. Like let us do things our way. And they're thinking about things that just should completely pale in comparison to the importance of the situation, but it doesn't, because that's just not how humans work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely kind of a large theme in this book. I kind of feel is just sort of that, like, I mean, obviously, I think we kind of talked about how at the end of it, it's more like it's a story about humans set to a backdrop of war.
Exactly.
And, that's just another way where that kind of comes out. Yeah.
Yeah. So then getting back to the snowstorm, the main point I wanted to touch on, this is something, so Ernest Hemingway in his time, he almost certainly wouldn't have identified as a Stoist, but he beautifully laid out, at least in the character of Robert Jordan, like a Stoic thought process. And I've mentioned that Stoicism, which I'm really into, mirrors mindfulness and Zen in a lot of ways, which is something that you're really into. So you remember when he's watching the snowstorm, at first he's really upset because he's like, this could literally ruin everything. This could definitely turn the tide of the battle he's going to be engaging in, and not necessarily turn the tide of the whole war, but would have an effect on the war effort overall, and an important one. So he's understandably frustrated, but then as he sits there, he's like, well, it's out of my hands. There's nothing I can do, so I might as well enjoy it, which at first you're like, well, how can you enjoy what's literally ruining the war for you and could cause a bunch of people on your side to die? But again, if there's nothing you can do about it, he thinks about when he was a child, how he always loved the snow and how it feels cozy and all those things. I mean, anyone who's ever been inside on a snowy day can totally relate to.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard this one, but there's this Zen story I've heard before. It's this man is being chased by a panther or mountain lion or something, or I think probably a tiger, because that part of the world would have tigers. Anyway, he's being chased by a tiger. He gets to the edge of a cliff, and there's vines over the cliff, so he tries to climb down the vines, but the vines don't go far enough, so he's just dangling on these vines on the edge of the cliff, and the tiger is coming to get him, so either the tiger will get him or he's going to fall, but either way, there's no way getting out of the situation. And then he looks around and he sees on the vine that he's been climbing down, there's some really delicious looking berries. And he's like, well, there's nothing I can do at this point. I'm going to die. I might as well just relax and enjoy these delicious berries, because that's the most I can get out of life right now.
I mean, yeah, that's a pretty... that's one that comes up in a lot of... I mean... there are entire just mindfulness meditations made around that visual. Often, for some reason it's always berries. You're always eating berries, and I don't know why. Sometimes it's not necessarily tigers. Sometimes it's I know I've heard it as vultures. I've heard it as you're on, on the ledge of a cliff. Sometimes it's there's a river down below you. Sometimes there's spiky rocks down below you. But
that's interesting. I didn't actually know whether it was real like original Buddhist teaching or something because I had it presented to me by like a Western
Yeah.
mindfulness, the meditation app I use. So I was like, is this just something made up to like explain it to Westerners, or is this an actual Buddhist
No,
teaching?
I actually don't know where it originates from. I just know that it is, I mean, in Western culture, so many different places. Like, I mean, I first encountered it in just, um, it was actually like a CBT class, like a little just
Mm,
mini guided meditation type thing that we did.
right. Cognitive behavioral therapy for
Yeah. So,
those who don't know.
in any case, yeah, it's fairly common. Just that visual, that little tidbit, I don't even know what to call it, has been used and kind of modified a bunch of different ways. In any case, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, what kind of within this book happens over 4 days, and it's kind of, the more I think about it, the more throughout those 4 days, there's just like every sort of range of human emotion, here, human experience that kind of pops up
Right.
in one way or another. And sometimes it's just the character's actually feeling like, like in the case of, it's just romance with Maria, like that's kind of catalyzed by the fact that there are only 4 days for him to, I mean, not necessarily only 4 days, but he feels there's a really real possibility he could only have 4 days left to, I guess, ever love somebody again, really. And kind of,
Yeah.
similar like this, I've definitely had experiences in my life where in catastrophic situations it's actually been the easiest to just kind of be like, okay, things are just insane right now. And normally I can never, I have a hard time relaxing, but sometimes the, super stressful situations actually are the times when I kind of can just sort of take a step back and relax.
For sure. Um, I mean, I'm sure you already know this with all the both practical and theoretical, like psychological knowledge you have, but I think there is like a very real psychological basis to that when basically, our minds are still evolutionarily designed for like 10,000 years ago when we would have to be like, there's a good reason for us to be anxious all the time because there could literally be a saber-toothed tiger behind every rock.
Mm-hmm.
So when things are calm, your brain is just sitting there producing like adrenaline or whatever, being like, okay, I need to be ready. I need to spot the next threat. I need to be ready. And then when nothing ever happens, it's just that continuous cycle. When
Yeah.
you are in a catastrophe, you're like, okay, now I know what to do. I respond to this situation. And
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Um, yeah, so I guess, did you have more
Well,
about
yeah, I just thought
Snowstorm?
that, well, that part in particular was interesting because I know like both Stoicism and Zen Buddhism definitely predate Hemingway, but
Mm-hmm.
as far as I know, I don't think Hemingway would have any knowledge of those traditions. Uh, I don't really
Maybe.
know how the spread of Zen Buddhism was, but like, was it big in like 20th century France?
Um, I wouldn't say big. I know kind of 1800s is sort of when it really kind of started to, late 1800s is when it sort of started, especially Japanese Buddhism, I believe, sort of
Mhm.
started kind of, some places in the US sort of started looking at it. But yeah, I mean, until the later half of the 20th century, I mean, that's when it really started exploding in just Western culture.
Right.
I mean, as you
So,
kind of said, I think the Stoicism has obviously been, um, it has been a thing in Western. It's been known about. Like, you go to some of the most read philosophers in the Western world, and some of them were Stoics. Um, and there is a lot of overlap between the two. So I think even if not Hemingway hadn't necessarily known about, um, Buddhism specifically, although that's actually a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about like if people living in that time period would have really I mean, it wouldn't surprise me to know they'd known about Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism is one of the biggest religions in the world,
Yeah.
and that's not a recent thing at all.
I know that, and I know, but a large part of that is because Asia is so populous, right?
It
Like,
is,
I don't
yes.
know, like, I don't know if it would have been as big in the West, but
No,
uh,
I mean, but
it is like you're right. It is totally possible though that he might have like read some Seneca or whatever in his time. So
yeah,
it is possible that my assumptions are completely wrong, and Hemingway actually did have these things presented to him. But my original point, assuming that he hadn't been reading any Buddhist or Stoicism stuff, and he came to these opinions on his own. If that is true, I would think that's really interesting. Like, I guess one of the best evidences for any idea for me, like if I see smart people or people I respect like independently coming to the same conclusions, I put like a lot more stock in those conclusions than if it's something like that someone comes up with and makes a really good case and convinces a lot of people of that still can be a good idea. But like, yeah, when you see people independently reach the same conclusions, then I think there's probably a good reason for that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just really hard to say. We just don't know the background
Yeah.
there.
So
But I mean, at the
yeah,
very least, even if he did read these ideas, obviously he felt there was enough merit in them to kind of have them sort of permeate into his writing. Um,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. I guess the last thing I have to say about the snowstorm. Well, first of all, it's just that like Hemingway just has really beautiful writing, and I think his whole description of the snowstorm shows that. But then also, I loved his description through Robert Jordan's thoughts of how, like, there are no enemies in a snowstorm. Because one, like all natural enemies or like predators and prey would be more focused on finding shelter than hunting each other or whatever. And then the fact that like visibility is just so limited that like a wolf could be standing next to an elk and they wouldn't even see each other or smell each other, which is the main way they hunt, and you can't really smell much in a driving blizzard.
Yeah.
So it's something I hadn't really thought about before consciously, but when I read it, it like really resonated with me as something that just seems like it's I don't know, it's one of those things that it's a kind of philosophical out there idea, but also it seems to be practically true. Like, yeah, there aren't really enemies in a storm or catastrophic situation. Yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but
I mean, not really. I can't. I'm having a hard time remembering the exact passage where he talked about that, but I mean, it makes sense. I mean, kind of, especially in war. Like, what's always interested me is when throughout a lot of history, not always, but war would kind of revolve around these things that were very specific to just, I mean, humans or animals in general. Like, war kind of seems like this thing that is caused by humans, like it's perpetrated by humans. It's a very human thing, but I know there always kind of seems to be a disconnect, especially today. Like, war is a little less personal, I guess. With all our killing machines, and each so much more of it is the number of steps between the human and an enemy who has died is on average much higher today, and even 80 years ago than it was just a couple hundred years ago. I mean 500, 600 years ago. You get down to that point where you are stabbing somebody with a sword, and your hand is physically coming within inches of another man. So, but even with all that, for so much of our history, like, war has just revolved around both our needs, like human needs, and also just kind of environmental factors, like these things that we just can't escape no matter how or it takes a huge amount of technological increase to get to the point where we can kind of escape them. Things like back in medieval times, during winter, war would just shut down. Like,
yeah.
even though, I mean, I'm sure you could find exceptions to this where people carried out, guerrilla attacks or just or sneak attacks, surprise attacks during winter, and then you have more
For sure,
recent
and
conflicts.
it would definitely be different. Like probably in sub-Saharan Africa, like those wars wouldn't have as much
Yeah, but I
respect
mean,
for the seasons.
you
But
can still have things like most of the time when night falls,
mhm.
even though that's a very vulnerable time for people, war still for the most part has just shut down for most of our history.
Yeah,
You to the point where people throughout history have really taken those things to heart, like you know in the Roman era, for example. Fighting was a very, I mean, back then, like, fighting really had to be honorable, like, or else it would just be a mess for everybody because everybody would be carrying out like sneak attacks at night, and it
yeah,
would, it's better for both sides, even if they're at war, to kind of have these conventions by which they fight, um, just so if you know that you're going to be honorable and not attack somebody during the night, then you can actually advantageous for you because you can kind of have that same assurance most of the time. Um,
for sure.
so, yeah, I mean, kind of, it's taken us so. War, our idea, I mean, and maybe it's just because we're not fighting these wars anymore, but war just kind of seems different than it was even 100 years ago, where it's just this less personal thing. Um, and I guess kind of that idea, yeah, there's no enemies in the snowstorm, kind of just goes to sort of highlight that, I guess, even at the end of it. War, it's a very human thing. You can't get away from those human animalistic things which kind of drive it.
For sure. Yeah, and kind of the environmental influence on conflict. I mean, until recently, we've kind of surpassed that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like you were saying, like in the medieval times, we'd hear of a war that goes on for like 5 years, and we just think of like this 5 year slogging war. But it literally is like, okay, it's summer, we go to war, and then okay, it's time to go home and tend the crops. And
Mm-hmm.
like most of the year, it's like the school season. Basically, you're back
Yeah.
home tending the crops, and then it's like, okay, harvest is done. Let's go back to war. Uh, yeah. Um, yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought on that, but oh, I do think it's interesting how you were saying like fighting. There was a point where like fighting honorably was also just the smart way to fight, and Rome definitely proved that because there was a point when Rome was fighting before they were like fighting themselves as much when they were fighting outside forces like the Celts and the Goths and the barbarians that they were going up against didn't necessarily fight the same honorable way, but
Mm-hmm.
that's part of why the Romans won because like a Roman phalanx of all their shields locked together and then the gladiuses poking out was just like a devastating way to fight a battle. And then they could be, marching in lockstep and someone could try to rain arrows on them since they seem like an easy target and they all put their shields up. And that is a very effective way of fighting. And then the honorable way of combat kind of evolved around that. And then, technological advances change everything in war, where you get to the American Revolution, and at first the British are still like, we're going to fight honorably, we're going to be marching in lockstep and uniform, and the Americans are like, yeah, we're just going to hide in the trees and shoot you.
Yeah.
And the British very quickly learned, like, yeah, we can't fight this way if we actually want to have a chance in this war. Um, Obviously, on a much bigger extent, that happened in World War One, where people didn't yet understand you can't charge up a hill at a machine gun, and it's like it would almost be comical if it wasn't so horrific. Like literally thousands of people just being mowed down in seconds because they don't quite understand how the technology has changed the
Mm-hmm.
war. Uh, yeah. So yeah, did you have any final thoughts? I mean, like we said, this is a very short segment today. We've gone about half an hour already. Um, we'll definitely have a lot more to say last or next.
Yeah. So I
Next week
mean,
on Thursday when we.
where have you where did you get to? I'm having a hard time remembering exactly where. I mean, because you had the snowstorm. I think in this you kind of had. I mean, obviously, since there is a snowstorm going on, they've kind of hunkered down there, talking about different things. Robert Jordan is thinking about different things, like, um, just kind of his discussions with, like, communist academics back in Madrid. I think is kind of um,
Yeah, okay, so I left off right at the beginning of chapter 18, so about
okay.
200 pages in, halfway through.
I see.
The last main thing that happened is Pablo had a weird, mysterious change of heart, which
Right.
I
Okay.
still don't
So
fully understand the implications of, but like when the snowstorm is like at first, oh yeah, this was another thought I was going to touch on, just the fact of how the snowstorm was obviously a complete random event, but at the beginning Pablo was kind of like, "See, I told you so. The attack on the bridge was a bad idea." And it's like no one knew the snow was going to happen obviously
mhm.
beforehand, so that doesn't really prove anything, but
Yeah,
it
I
kind
mean,
of
it
does
doesn't
give him the power
necessarily
in that situation.
prove anything. I mean, that obviously there are some indications that this bunch are, sort of superstitious in some ways,
Yeah, yeah, that is true.
and they obviously they've already. I know, like the last kind of outsider to come through. Oh crap! What was his name?
Oh,
The
the
guy
one who died in
Pilar
the
smelled death on.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and Robert Jordan ended up killing him.
yeah, so
Like
obviously,
not like murdering, but like shooting him because he was injured.
yeah. Um, obviously the last outsider that came through. I mean, it didn't go horrendously for them exactly, but he just kind of ended up in a bad way. They've started off with not having fantastic experiences with. I mean, even as I understand it, the other guy was a perfectly okay person. He just, well, I mean, he obviously was a little, maybe didn't have the stomach for war quite as much as Robert Jordan did. Um,
For sure.
but yeah, I mean, it definitely kind of could seem like, I think humans in general are, we're made to kind of pattern match basically. Like we look for patterns even where there aren't necessarily patterns. As a kind of thing where we can have our fears sort of validated by things that happen, even if those things are completely random events that nobody could have ever predicted. Um,
For sure. We
so
are very prone to logical fallacy.
yeah, um, yeah.
But yeah, so before I'm sure you know the answer to this, so no spoilers, but where I left off was the snow starts to end and Pablo just comes up and he's like, "Hey, we'll have good weather for it." And they're like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's great that the snowstorm is starting to end because now we can blow up the bridge." And everyone's like, "You like were furious about the idea of blowing up the bridge." And he's like, "Yeah, well, I thought about it and then I changed my mind."
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah,
know
I
if
guess.
that's him adapting and thinking like they're just gonna
Yeah.
kill me if I don't join, or
I think. So I think you've gone past the part where Robert Jordan. I mean, maybe that is the part where Robert Jordan kind of equates his whole like experience with Pablo kind of as like a merry-go-round. Um,
uh, that's literally the first words of chapter 18. Like I'm looking at them now.
okay.
That's right where I left off.
Yeah. So I mean, kind of. Yeah, I think it's kind of apt, and I think it kind of I think it's an experience that a lot of people have with sort of a lot of things in life. Maybe that's not quite true, but
No, it is for sure. I mean, it is a very realistic portrayal of a person. I've actually joked a lot, especially when talking to like other writers and stuff. But I think it's very difficult to write like actually an actual realistic character into a story without like, oh, like this character's motivations don't make any sense, and like the author obviously doesn't know what they're doing with this character, because the way we expect people to act in stories and the way people actually act rationally according to their core motivations or whatever. So
mm-hmm.
yeah, I do think Pablo is a very realistic character. I'm just interested to see where this goes.
Yeah, well, I think there are throughout the story as a whole, and obviously you haven't read the whole story, but there are kind of like mini cycles. You're kind of seeing an entirety of a life almost play out within just 4 days. So that's kind of one cycle. You're seeing Pablo's different emotions, even just the story as a whole kind of takes a whole course like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, I won't spoil anything, but.
All right.
I guess even just like I guess you, at this point you've kind of, because this is on the second day, right?
I don't even know at this point.
So I mean, you're starting to kind of see a pattern emerge, sort of with like Robert Jordan and Maria, almost.
Yeah.
Where kind of they're getting sort of closer, and then something will happen that puts them a little apart, a little not exactly at odds, but
Yeah.
So yeah. No, I really like that in books, and to the point where it's almost one of the issues I have writing books, where I feel like I have to have things kind of be like fractaled, almost like repeating, tessellating.
Well, I mean, that is like a lot of advice and wisdom. He does mirror that. So if you have that impulse, that is a good impulse according to a lot of the idea that that should be how you set up the climax, for example, is early on a small kind of low stakes situation will play out, and in the climax is basically a much grander scale of that same conflict. And
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's a pattern I've seen in a lot of works, and maybe I've read a lot of works that have had that as a pattern and I just haven't noticed it, but yeah, there's something just kind of pleasing about it, I guess.
Right.
All right, well, I didn't have too many other thoughts, and for next time we do this, I definitely will do a lot better at kind of going through, taking notes, really think about what I'm going to say, because at this point it really has been literally over a month since I've read the book, so it's a little unfortunate.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, that's like I said, the show started off kind of ramshackle, but we've got a good schedule laid out now, so
Sure.
yeah.
All right,
that will be all for tonight's segment. Again, short and sweet segment. We'll probably have a much longer book club next time because we'll try to finish up this book.
Thursday at 11 is when we have our next real episode. We're trying to kind of not real episode. That's when we're starting our next episode. We're trying to finish up this episode before then, so the next couple of days we will also
tie up loose ends.
Streaming in the evening, I believe.
Yep. So that's going to be Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then no real schedule for the rest of this episode, but we'll be getting the segments out, and look forward to those.
All right. Okay, well, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for anybody who listens. And we will be back soon.
Yep. See ya.